Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I am doing really well. I spent the weekend getting to go to this fun event with one of my favorite bands. Some of our listeners may remember PFR from the 90s. And I
Yeah.
got to go hang out with PFR and watch them record and all this stuff. It was a Christmas gift from one of my really good friends. And so spent the weekend with a really good friend, got to meet one of my favorite bands. It was a good weekend.
Wow. What a cool experience.
Yeah, it was incredible. But what about you? How are you doing?
I am doing great. So some of our longtime listeners will know that my daughter has been gearing up for a 4-month mission trip to South Africa and Eswatini. And I'm very excited because just yesterday she finally arrived in Eswatini, and she's just getting adjusted to her new environment and getting ready to dive into ministry down there. So it's just cool. She has dreamt of being in Africa since she was 8 years old, and here she is getting to do it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yes. Yes. I'm very happy for her and love hearing all the stories and all the things that are happening. So it's really good.
I think that's incredible. What an experience.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so what are you calling about today? I'm excited to talk.
Yeah. So we were chatting the other day and we stumbled across this phenomenon that happens in the church quite frequently. And that is taking verses out of context. And we realized that oftentimes these are verses that Paul used. And so I thought it would be fun to do just kind of a little mini series where we take one of these verses that often gets talked about out of context and just do a little series called Misquoting Paul, and just try to dive into, okay, if that's not really what he intended by that verse, what can we glean from the context, from the book itself? How do we actually live in light of some of these really well-known and often misquoted verses?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited about this. And when I look at these, what's fascinating to me is that not that they are misunderstood necessarily so much as they are isolated from their context, right? Like,
Yeah.
I do not love when somebody takes what I say out of context. This happens. Have you ever had this happen with your children? Like, it was just a couple of weeks ago. I had said to my daughter and I hang out most of the time Tuesday nights. And there was this one week where we were coming home from a trip on a Monday. My wife was leaving on a Friday. And we basically just had like the 3 days in the middle, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And I really wanted to hang out with my wife. And so I said to my kids, who I normally hang out with on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, I said, hey guys, this week we're just not going to do any of that. Their weeks also happened to be super full that week. I was going to be with my daughter all day on Saturday, for example, because there was going to be a debate tournament that she was helping to run for middle school students that I had volunteered to judge at. And so my weekend was going to be really full. I just hadn't had a lot of downtime. I want to spend time with my wife. And so I say to my daughter, hey, we're not going to do any extra random hanging out this week because there's just not time in the week for it. And I don't cancel this lightly or often. I think this is the first time I had canceled it without rescheduling inside of like 6 months. And she's like, Dad, you said we are hanging out every Tuesday. And I was like, hold on. Yes. What I meant was we're hanging out on Tuesdays. I don't mean the world is falling apart and it's the end of the universe if a Tuesday goes by and we're not hanging out. Those, right? Like,
Yeah.
Context matters a lot. Um,
Yes. Yes, it does. And this whole series has made me think of this great quote. I'm not sure where I heard it, but especially with today, because today we're going to talk about Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Many people have reworked that verse to say, I can do all things through a verse taken out of context.
I haven't heard that. Um, I can at least tell myself that I can do all things through a verse that's taken out of context. Um,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it feels good, right? We took it out of context and applied it to our situation, not because we thought it would make things worse, but because we thought it would make things better. It's just we might not actually be using it right.
Absolutely. So let me read you this verse, and then I'm curious what you typically have understood this verse to mean.
Okay, go ahead.
So this is I feel like this is one of the most popular things that Paul has ever said. It's, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. What
Yeah,
does that mean?
right? Well, I'll tell you what it means, at least in pop culture. And it was fascinating to me as I was doing a bit of research for this to realize the number of people that actually have Philippians 4:13 tattoos. And they're people that
Oh,
you wouldn't necessarily think of. And the reason I got started on this was because I remembered that Tim Tebow, the football player, used to put like that eye black that goes on your cheekbones and helps shade glare from your eyes. That eye black that he used to put on, he used to write in white lettering various Bible references, including John 3:16 and Philippians 4:13. And so
mm,
I was like, okay, so that's kind of part of the pop culture. But then some people may know this person. I was not familiar with him. John Jones. He's a UFC lightweight fighter. And on his chest, and all the UFC guys, they always are without shirts on. And so he has this huge, in scrawling font, this Philippians 4:13 on his chest. And then even Selena Gomez evidently has a version of this tattooed on her hip. And I'll tell you, in those contexts, Philippians 4:13 seems to indicate I can accomplish really big goals because God gives me strength to do it. I can be a champion. I can be the top of my game with God on my side.
yes, I think that's exactly it. I think of the basic sort of message that I feel like I heard growing up in elementary school, which was, if you want to be an astronaut, you can totally be an astronaut. If you want to
Yeah.
be a doctor, you can totally be a doctor. If you want to be a lawyer, if you work hard enough, you absolutely can be a lawyer. Now, as I'm thinking about this, and you mentioned Tim Tebow, I probably could never be a fullback
Okay, there's no
or a
probably there.
linebacker.
No, that's
I
just not
weigh
in your cards, buddy.
I weigh 155 pounds.
Yeah, you could be the football.
I could literally be the football, but I could not be the fullback.
Right, right.
Um,
Yeah, but then people throw on Philippians 4:13 and they're like, well, okay, nothing's impossible with God, so I can do all things through and it's funny. They always say I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, but though I don't think that that's necessarily wrong, the text literally says him who strengthens me.
yeah, well, and before we jump into the context here, one other point that needs to be made is that there is something skewing about the fact that the people we know of who have these tattoos or who tout this verse are all famous and successful,
Mm, yeah, yeah.
right? Because they're not even necessarily saying, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. When we look at it, I think there's an inclination to say they did do all things through Christ who strengthens them. She made an amazing singing career. He has succeeded in becoming an incredible MMA fighter. He is a world-class football player. They chose their path. They got to the top of the heap, all because Jesus was empowering them to do it. So can I.
Yeah. And then we start printing this on t-shirts, on stickers, on Bible covers, on bookmarks, on anything you can think of. And we put it in our lives, whether we wear it or whether we use it as a bookmark or we just put it on the wall or whatever, as motivation to say, see, I can accomplish these huge, amazing things too.
Yep. And sometimes I can't. Like, if I'm being really honest, I have spent the last year working for myself as a consultant. A major part of what a consultant does is sell his services to people every single day, convincing people that he or she has something that they need in order to be successful.
Hmm.
That is a huge skill set. And I have discovered over the last year and a half, it is neither a skill set I have nor a skill set that I think I can honestly and comfortably cultivate within myself.
Mm.
I can't be the person who sells himself all the time. I'm not saying somebody else shouldn't be. I'm saying I personally, Josh from Missouri, can't be that guy. Like when I have to grab the phone and make the follow-up call to say, do you in fact want to buy the thing that we talked about buying? When the thing we talked about was time with me and I'm asking you to pay for it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you're bringing up your own limitations here, because I think if we one take this verse out of context and then apply it too rigorously, it could lead to a sense of, well, I just don't have enough faith.
Yes.
I'm not doing it right because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So I should probably be a better marketer of myself. And one, that's not what the verse is saying. And two, what a detrimental application that would be.
Yes. Instead of it sort of giving life and hope, it is soul crushing, right?
Yeah.
I ought to be this. I'm a failure. I don't have enough faith. That's a painful place to end up. And it's not hard to imagine going from there into a shame spiral.
Right. Right. Well, okay. So I love that we're unpacking what this verse does not mean, but I'm really eager to get into what this verse does mean. And as we do that, I think there's some basic hermeneutical principles that we need to apply. And hermeneutics is just the study of interpretation, what are the principles of interpreting a passage that we need to apply. And so I wonder if you could guide us through just some basic good ideas for making sure we understand what a verse means.
That's a great point. The one big idea that matters to me more than anything else when I'm reading anything in the Bible is context is king.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
you look at a verse in terms of, for me, I need to start big picture and work my way to little picture. That's the way my brain works. So I need to look at Philippians as a whole in this case and ask, what is going on in Philippians as a whole? What are the various pieces of that? And what is the sort of flow of thought from piece to piece from the beginning to the end of the book? And then how does this verse function inside of that context? For me, that's what it's about. Are there other hermeneutical principles that you're thinking of besides context is king?
I mean, context really is king. And I think that always has to be the number one principle. I would add to that, what did the author intend for the original audience to hear by saying what they said?
Mm,
It has to start there. I think sometimes it's easy to skip over that step and just, what does this verse mean to me? And I think that's why we get in danger with this and many other verses. What does it mean to me that Paul said, I can do all things through him who strengthens me? It means I can become a champion, or I can accomplish big goals. Well, that may not be what he intended his original audience to hear. And so we need to start there before we start applying it to ourselves.
that's so good. And I think there is actually something not just hermeneutically important about that. I actually think in terms of spiritual formation, it is wildly important to remember we are simply bystanders listening in on a conversation. It is an invaluable way of humbling ourselves and remembering we are not the epicenter of the story.
Hmm.
And I think we all desperately need as many reminders of that as we can get.
Yeah.
With all of that in mind, talk to me about what you think Philippians is all about. What's the big picture of Philippians?
Yeah. I mean, Philippians is a letter from Paul to a church in a particular moment in time. And knowing exactly what Paul was up to in that moment has been tricky. There's a lot of different options, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to choose one. It's very likely that Paul was in prison at this time and writing to the church in Philippi that he loved. This is one of the churches that he founded. We can read about it in the book of Acts. He founded it with Lydia and the Roman jailer and the girl that was delivered from a demon possession. And so he loves this church. He has spent much time with this church, and this church in turn loves him. And when they knew that he was in prison, they took up an offering and they sent Epaphroditus, one of their parishioners, to Paul to deliver this gift that they had collected for him. And, that could be used for legal fees. That could be used for supplying himself while he's in prison. It could be used for a variety of different things. And it was such a kind gesture. But on top of that, Epaphroditus nearly died in the process. We don't really know how, but Paul was writing to thank them so much for their thoughtfulness, to celebrate all the ministry that they had done together over the years, to celebrate the example of Christ-like love that lived in their midst, and to also send Epaphroditus back to them carrying this letter and say, look, he's home. And by the way, thank you guys. I love you and I care for you, and I thank you that you love and care for me. It is such a joyful letter in the midst of Paul's imprisonment. It's really a fun and actually short read. So if y'all haven't read it recently, I encourage you to do it. It's such a great book.
Yeah, it really, really is. Did you ever do the thing with a magnifying glass and a leaf when you were a kid, when you burned the leaf?
Oh, yeah. And then you start frying ants with it too in a very
Yes.
destructive way. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I remember when I was a kid, I had a magnifying glass that it was not strong enough to do this, but I had two of them. And
Mm.
so I remember holding one above the other and getting the sun to go through the first magnifying glass. And then at the focal point of the light coming out of that magnifying glass, I put the second magnifying glass, and that focused it even more. And by the time it got through the second one, I could burn the leaf, the worm, or the ant at my will. Does this
Making
make
every
sense?
10-year-old boy's dream come true.
Joy unbounded, right?
Yes.
So when I think about Philippians, I think that there are three magnifying glasses that Paul is sort of, if you imagine these as the three central ideas, that Paul is trying to get us to look through all three at the same time. And that sort of brings into focus so much of the letter for me. And I don't think this is unusual to Philippians. I think, if we start with probably one of the most theologically rich parts of the book, Philippians 2 has this beautiful poem from 6 to 11 that apparently lots of people think Paul borrowed from church culture. It's the same way you would quote a worship song. He's quoting what is basically a worship song. And
Yeah.
it talks about how Jesus humbled himself all the way to the cross. And in the midst of that, I think that's the first magnifying glass. And if you look through that, the next thing you're going to see is Paul's understanding of his own story, where he is trying to live out this exact same sacrificial love that Jesus lived out on the cross. And so his story becomes an exposition of Jesus' humbling of himself and willingness to sacrifice himself and die on a cross. And
Mm-hmm.
then I think the implied invitation is local church bodies, particularly in this case, the Philippian church, is the third magnifying glass. Now the invitation is, you have seen the self-sacrificing love of Jesus exposited in the life of Paul. Now live it out in your own lives. And that can look like a lot of different things. It can look like serving Paul himself in his weakest moments. It can look like loving one another within the context of the local church. It can look like a lot of different things, but it feels to me like that's sort of those are the three layers of Paul's thought that are constantly interacting with one another as he talks to the Philippian church about ideas like joy and suffering and sacrifice, generosity and humility.
Yeah. Yes. 100%. I think you're exactly right. I love your analogy of the three magnifying glasses. I just think that's a really cool way to think about that. So this everything you were talking about though with these three magnifying glasses reminds me of something that Michael Gorman said in Cruciformity, because this is very much his argument throughout the book, that Paul is trying to live his life in the same form of a cross that Jesus lived his own life. And so when we look at Philippians 2, 6 through 11 and see the example of Jesus being obedient all the way to the cross, Paul is trying to live that out in his own life. And Michael Gorman pulls that out. He says the weakness Paul experiences demonstrate for him the power of Christ. These weaknesses are both physical and social or cultural and attitudinal. Some are chosen, some are not. He goes on to say, thus, whenever Paul explains or defends himself, he is explaining and defending his weakness as the necessary corollary of the gospel of Christ crucified as the power of God. And so he sees the whole central reality of living as a Christian to be this crucified existence that is ultimately, in some mixed up, backwards, upside down way, the actual power of God in this world. And Paul wants to live that out. And then he wants that to be a model for his churches to follow, just like he's following Christ.
100%. And first of all, I don't want it to sound like I was coming up with anything particularly clever. I am in the midst of reading Cruciformity, and it has been incredibly influential in my thinking. So my way of seeing this is profoundly influenced by Gorman.
Yeah, of course.
But I also think it's interesting in the context of a book like Philippians, not only is Paul saying, what makes me an authentic follower of Jesus and apostle is the suffering that I have endured. But the opposite is also true. He is willing to take on false teachers, people who are trying to lead the church astray. And he's arguing that seen through these three lenses, their apostleship is not real, not his. Because often Paul is getting attacked, right? Oh, you're
Sure.
not a real apostle. Look at what's happening to you.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
his response is, no, I am a real apostle. Look at what happened to Jesus and look at what happened to me. Do you see any similarities? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And you definitely see a lot of that coming out, like in Corinthians, both first and second Corinthians. But, yeah, I think that context kind of lies behind a lot of his letters.
yeah. Well, and it struck me, where was it? Yeah, in Philippians chapter 3, where he's saying this again, beware of the dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. You know,
Mm,
he goes on to say, they have confidence in their flesh, but if they can, I could have more. It's just that that's not what matters,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and share the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death.
Yeah. Which is so, like, I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about that because that's just so foreign to our ears.
Mm-hmm.
But it sets the context, I think, really well for Philippians 4. And so I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if you could summarize for us the immediate context of this verse that we take out of context, Philippians 4:13.
Yeah, I'm super intrigued by this because Paul is getting to the end, right? He's running down, so to speak. He's talked about the sacrifice of Jesus. He's talked about what that looks like in his own life in chapter 3. And now he is directly addressing the church in a host of ways. And in a lot of Paul's letters, there end up being sort of a host of short sentences that sort of spew out of him that are just poignant advice. So, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Don't be anxious for anything. These sorts of sentences. And as he gives this all this advice, and then he goes on to thank the Philippians. It's almost like I feel like we're getting to like, oh, I had one other thing I had to say. And he thanks the Philippians for this gift that they have given him. And in the middle of it, he's saying, not that I needed your gift. I don't know if he's afraid of looking self serving, but it comes across that way to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like when I was pastoring, whenever I would ask somebody if they wanted to serve in a particular way in church, I would often say, hey, you seem like you would be really good at serving in this particular way. And I'd like you to think about that. But don't answer me now because I never want to be accused of twisting somebody's arm to get them to serve. So if you're interested, you come back and talk to me later. That way, it's entirely on you. No pressure, no stress. It feels to me like Paul is having a similar response to the perceived sort of power dynamics in his relationship. Hey, I'm not trying to manipulate you into giving me more money. I'm not trying to say you ought to have given me money. What I'm saying is that your money was awesome. But in the middle of saying that gift was awesome, he says, I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty, of being in need. And then he says the verse, I can do all things through Christ, through him who strengthens me. Wow, I almost said it wrong. That's hilarious. You literally said that thing earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so when you hear it in that context, what does that one verse, that famous verse, mean to you?
Yeah. So, I'm not going to be able to do any of these episodes without going to the original languages and really diving in.
I am
And
so excited.
yeah, so I actually was looking at that word that I have learned to be content in every situation.
Mm,
And that idea of learning, there's a lot of different words for learning. And so I don't know that I have the greatest grasp of it, but from what I could gather from different lexicons that I looked at, it really has this sense of like going to school and having learned and absorbing a lesson over time. And I kind of feel like Paul is saying, I've been to the school of hard knocks And in the school of hard knocks, I've learned how to just not let it bother me that much. I could have a lot one day and I could have a little bit another day, and it doesn't matter. None of my well-being rests on how good it's going for me in that time. Instead,
Yeah.
I can face all of that stuff because of Christ who gives me strength. That's where I get my strength. It has nothing to do with having a good day or having a bad day. And then I also think in the actual verse itself, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This idea of doing all things is fascinating because it literally reads, I have strength for all things because of him who strengthens me. And that really does carry with it this idea of I have the ability or I have the strength to accomplish these things or I have the strength to face these things. But it just says I have strength to these things because of him who strengthens me. And I think that's important because we abuse this verse by emphasizing our own doing so much. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I don't know that Paul fully intends the doing part. I think he's saying I have the strength for all things. I can bear up under all things. I can get through all things because of Christ who gives me strength, or because of him who gives me that strength.
Yeah, I totally agree. What I was really struck by as we move into what do we do with this verse, I am struck by a split that happens in our approach to spirituality, and people end up on one side or the other. The basic split is God going to empower me to change my circumstances, or is God going to empower me to be content within my circumstances?
Yes.
This translates straight into prayer, right? Like, there are people who say the primary focus of prayer is that it should change me. That's the be content in my circumstances people. There are other people who say, no, 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 no. I'm not praying because of me. I'm praying because I'm asking God to do something to change the world. Those are the change my circumstances people. So I think that this is a really practical issue that we have to wrestle with.
You're exactly right. And I think the wrestling goes on. And I think you can point to verses that live on both sides of that divide. So I don't want to say that this verse answers that debate entirely, but we do have to try to understand this verse rightly to see which side of that divide it actually sits on. And this verse, to me, sits on the side of being content in whatever circumstance. God needs to work on me. God needs to give me the strength in the midst of the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever. And if you find that kind of contentment in Christ, then I think you're speaking the same language as Paul here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the balance for me is knowing that no one would ever call Paul a passive person, right? Like,
No.
he is plugging along, changing the world. But whatever he's doing in life, it is not about circumstances. It is not about results. He is doing what he has to do. You know, I'm always struck by the moment in Isaiah's life where he is called by God, and God in Isaiah 6 more or less says, you are going to be an utter failure as a prophet. Now get to it. Right? Like, nobody's going to listen to you, Isaiah. For how long? Till the country falls apart. Okay, that's a great calling. And on some level, Paul's sense of vocation certainly inspires action in him, but he is, on the flip side, very, very content in every moment, regardless of the context. And this is where I think this puts such a beautiful period on the sentence that he is saying throughout the book of Philippians. it's almost like a reversal moment, right? Like Jesus was willing to humble himself and serve and be crucified, and Paul is willing to suffer, and he's inviting the church to be willing to suffer. But now there's this teaching on what does it look like to do that in a Christ-like manner. You're not bitter, you're not angry. Embracing that does not give you the freedom to be a curmudgeonly old man. There is a way of being required in the midst of that self-sacrifice that is as important as the sacrifice itself.
Yeah, it reminds me, we were just talking this morning in sermon prep about John 21, and this is the very, very end of John's gospel. And I think everybody's familiar with the moment that Jesus and Peter kind of have this reconciliation moment where Jesus is like, do you love me? And yes, of course I love you, and feed my sheep and all of that. Well, at the very end of that, Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. And then we get to the passage we were discussing. Peter turned around and saw John and he goes, well, what about this guy? Like, I'm going to get martyred in my old age. That sounds lovely. Thanks for that. What about him? And Jesus said, well, if I want him to remain until I get back, what's that to you? You follow me. And I felt like it was very similar to Isaiah's calling, where it was like, dude, I'm telling you, this is what it's going to require for you to follow me. Do that. Keep your eyes on your own paper, Peter. Just follow me. And I think Paul is saying, look, I'm willing to just follow Christ. Whether that leads in martyrdom or not, whatever, I've learned to be content with that. I can do all of that because Christ gives me strength to do it.
Yes, I think that's exactly it. So we're getting close to time here, but I wonder if it's worth taking a few minutes to ask, what does that look like day to day following Jesus here and now? How do we translate that experientially?
Yeah, for me, I think there are times, and I've seen it in conversations with other people, and it's easier to articulate from that perspective. I've heard so many people that have a clear sense of mission and what they feel gifted to do for the kingdom of God. And I admire the work that they're doing. I admire the steps that they're taking, all of those things. But it seems like to a person, there always comes this moment where the mission feels too big or too heavy or too burdensome. I don't know how I'm going to care for this many hurting people in my church. I don't know how I'm possibly going to pray for all of these people and all of these needs that I've experienced. I don't know how I'm possibly going to give up that much of my time to these ministries that I care about, or whatever it is. I feel like there's this moment where it feels overwhelming to live out your place in the kingdom of God. And I think that's where this verse really comes in, where you get to say, no, I can live a cruciformed life. I can live a life of service and death to self, and Christ will give me strength for that. I can rest on him throughout all of it. And that's a good place to go. It's a good place to return night after night, day after day. I mean, I'm thinking about Jesus and his often stepping away and praying in the middle of nowhere. This was him saying, I rest on my Father and I need to just reconnect with him in the midst of this really hard ministry. I feel like that's the modern application that comes to mind for me. But what about you?
First of all, I love that. Uh, the one that comes to me is just the question, knowing that this is about sacrificial love for Paul, and he talks about this with his with the church in Philippi, asking them, even in chapter 2, the opening to that beautiful hymn is asking for unity in the church. And the question I find myself asking is, how can I love others in a way that is costly to me?
Hmm.
And part of that, I think, is being willing to not have my way in the church, not make people think like me, act like me, believe quite like me, worship quite like me, whatever the issue is. It's just amazing to me that the one of the great calls in the midst of this letter is church unity, which I do think more than we acknowledge requires sacrificial love.
Yeah. That's so good. Well, I want to turn to the audience and say, what does this verse mean to you? Did it change over the course of this conversation? Do you have some great examples of how this has been used effectively in your life or in the lives of those around you? This really is a good verse to memorize and to utilize, but it does need to be kept within its context and applied correctly. So how have you seen that play out in your life or in the lives of those around you? And then share this conversation with a friend and start a conversation of your own around the proper use of Philippians 4:13.
Exactly. So I am looking forward to this series. I'm so excited about it. Next time, we're going to talk about Romans 8:28. Again, one of the most famous verses, I think, in the New Testament. And I am really intrigued to try to dig into the big picture of Romans and what Paul is saying by the time he gets to chapter 8. So
Mm.
I'm looking forward to that. But before anything else, Josh, I am so curious what else you have been thinking about this week.
Yeah, so this thought came out of a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about the personal nature of God and the fact that he is known by a variety of different names. Some of them indicate how personal he is. And one of those that my friend mentioned that I hadn't really thought much about is the fact that all throughout the Old Testament, God is referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as we started talking about that, I started to realize that, at least initially, when that phrase was used, it would have stirred in their minds the exact stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which are not all flattering. They are not spiritual heroes in so many ways. And so when God is saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's saying, I am the God of their redemption story. And you can recall all the specifics of their story and realize that God is the God, their own personal God, the one that redeemed even those guys. So we started to name people that we had previously been discussing and saying, imagine so-and-so, who's the father of so-and-so, who's the father of so-and-so. And so you just take your friends and you say, yeah, the God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, that is the God of Frank, his son Seth, and his grandson Joe. And you all of a sudden you just start knowing their stories and you go, man, I don't know. It brought to me the personal nature of God in a really cool way.
That's amazing. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. That is worth trying to do sometime this week, is calling God the God of so and so and so and so and so and so and people that we actually know.
Yeah.
Man, that's cool.
Yeah. But what about you? What are you thinking about?
I have started my reading for my Doctor of Ministry degree. And this is just
Yeah.
yes, this is a almost completely non-spiritual thought from the initial reading. Um, it's
Wow.
this
That's not
fascinating
what I
book.
expected.
No, right? Um, it's this book on prayer and temperament, and I'm really intrigued by it. So it's actually asking the question, let's take the 16 personality types of the Myers-Briggs and ask how that should influence the way we pray. Fascinating question. What
Yeah.
I think is the most interesting about it is if you know the Myers-Briggs, it basically evaluates four different traits in your personality, and each of those four traits, there is a preference pair. So the first is an I or an E. You're either an introvert or an extrovert. The second one is an N or an S. You either take in information via intuition or through sensation. The third is judging or perceiving. This is how you evaluate the world outside of you. And then the nope, that's the fourth one. Sorry, I skipped the middle one. It's the TF. That's the middle one. Thinking or feeling. That's how you evaluate the world outside of you. Does all of this kind of ring a basic bell to you?
It sure does.
Okay, here is the piece of information that I did not know. So, of those four pairings, the fourth pair, which is either a J or a P, actually tells you whether or not the second pair or the third pair is more central to the way you deal with reality. So if you are a P, pairing two, the N or the S is more important to you. If you are a J, pairing three, the T or the F is more important to you. So
Hmm.
it actually tells you in that last letter which of the middle two is your dominant kind of pairing. And I just didn't know that. And I think that's fascinating.
Nice. Are you willing to reveal your letters on the air?
Oh, sure. I have taken this a million times and I am an INFJ every single time. What about you?
I have not taken it recently enough to be able to say.
Oh,
So I apologize. I cannot reciprocate.
all right. Well, the heck with you then.
Okay. All right.
Hmm.
Hence your J. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's move to a Which Josh question then so that we can both have fun again.
Ooh, let's do it.
All right. Which Josh got schooled by an elderly Amish farmer?
Okay. This is 100% me,
I
and it was amazing.
This is such an intriguing question. I mean, I've never thought I would say the words, which Josh got schooled by an elderly Amish farmer. I now I need
Yes.
to know the story.
Yes. So here's what happened. I told you I was out seeing my favorite band this last weekend, and I went with my buddy, and the two of us are 40 something professionals, right? Like, and we are dressed the way 40 something professionals are going to be dressed: dark jeans, black t shirts, hoodies, not sneakers, dress shoes. Like, I mean, if there was a uniform for stereotypical us, we were wearing it.
Okay.
And we're in this hotel and we're headed down to the lobby, and it stops halfway, and in walk these two elderly Amish farmers. I mean, they have to be 65, 70 years old, and they are so stereotypical in their Carhartt jeans and their hats and beard, the whole thing. I mean, you are right now picturing exactly the right thing to a T. It was so funny how stereotypical they were that I could barely keep from laughing. And they walk in the elevator and they are not quite savvy of the elevator etiquette that exists but has never been written down anywhere. We all know how to operate in an elevator.
Yeah.
You know, you don't look at the other people. You just kind of, everybody looks at the front, whatever. They walk in, they're just staring at us, whatever. And I just, it's so stereotypical. I'm having a hard time not laughing. And in the midst of this, the two elderly farmers look at each other And all he says is, well, what do you think of this year's corn crop?
Okay.
And he smirks at me. And I cannot explain to you how he communicated everything I'm about to say, but I checked with my buddy who was there, and he said the exact same thing. In the way that he said this, I could instantly tell, A, that he knew that I was perceiving him as practically a caricature of who he was. B, he successfully communicated to me through my utter lack of knowledge about corn crops the fact that I was also a caricature of who I am. And C, that he was reading all the dynamics that were happening in the elevator perfectly well and was not ignorant of any of it, but that he managed to be not particularly judgy about it, and I had not quite pulled that off. So there.
Oh my gosh. That is old man brilliance right there.
It really was. Like, my buddy and I burst out laughing and they were smiling as well, but we burst out laughing. He left me stunned in silence. We walked out and we must have talked about it for the next half hour. I mean, I have seldom been in a room with somebody who could read the room and communicate that level of subtext that brilliantly. It was jaw-droppingly good.
Wow. Good for him. And what a cool, what a cool experience. You definitely got schooled by an old Amish farmer.
Sit down, young one. Oh my goodness. You think you're so impressive, and let me tell you, you're not. It was just crazy. But anyway, so I have been schooled by an elderly Amish farmer.
Yes, you have. Thank you for sharing it on the podcast. That was a great way to end this episode.
My pleasure. Talk to you next week.
Let's do it.
All right, I'll talk to you then.
All right, bye.